Hello everyone. Today, Paolo, Solmars, and I will be presenting on Chapter 9, Financial Reporting of State and Local Governments. First things first, this chapter highlights the importance of determining what a government reporting entity is before preparing financial reports. So, what is a government reporting entity? Well, Section 2100 of the GSAB codification provides us with guidance on defining these entities. Essentially, what you'll find is that the financial reporting entity is the collection of the primary government and all the organizations for which it is financially accountable. The primary government is usually the state or local general purpose governments, which aim to provide a wide variety of services. We know this because we learned this from the previous chapters. They can also be special purpose governments, which we know exist to only perform a specific function. Just as a recap, these are legally separate entities existing on their own, and they're also fiscally independent of the primary government. Here's a simplified version of a test you can use to determine financial accountability. If the primary government appoints a voting majority of the organization's governing board, is able to impose its will on the organization, receives benefits or burdens from an organization, then it's financially accountable for that organization. Or if the organization is fiscally dependent on the primary government, then is also considered to be financially responsible for that organization. So in applying what we know here in Guam, we come to find out that there are a lot of government organizations in Guam that are fiscally dependent on the primary government. And what we'll see in the next slide is that these are reported in the government of Guam's financial statements as component units. If you take a look here in GovGuam's 2019 financial statements, you're able to see all the component units of GovGuam. These are very important. Component units are separate in that they are their own entity, but they're still fiscally dependent on the primary government and therefore must be included as part of the financial reporting entity. If you take them out of the financial reports, the numbers will be affected, sometimes in a large enough value that it can potentially mislead financial statement users. Lastly, as a note, a brief description of components is required to be included in the notes to the financial statements. You can actually see that here in the screenshot that I included. Very briefly, I'll describe line B, which states GCC was created by the Community College Act of 1977 and is governed by a 9-member Board of Trustees, all of whom are appointed by the Governor of Guam. GovGuam also provides financial report to GCC through legislative appropriations. Under Section 2100 of the GSAB codification, it must be reported as a component unit of the financial reporting entity because the majority of its board, or in this case the entirety, is appointed by the governor, who is a part of the primary government. I'll now be handling the presentation to Paulo.
Hey guys, I'll be discussing through the presentation of all the basic government financial statements. Before the preparation of the government-wide financial statements, adjusting and closing entries must be recorded. Shown are the adjusting entries pertaining to capital assets to depreciate it with debit expense and a credit to accumulated depreciation. For closing entries, revenues and expenses that were recorded in the government funds are debited and credited respectively. The difference between the revenue and expense amounts is reported as net position unrestricted account. Essentially, net position unrestricted is the residual amount not included between any net investment capital assets or restricted net positions. Moving on, we examine through GovGuam's financial statement, with the first one being the statement of net position. It presents the financial position of the governmental entity and it discretely presents the component units. The first thing to note and consider is that the component units amounts are reported separately from the primary governments. Similar to the regular financial accounting balance sheet, net position reports assets, liabilities, but net position. It's labeled as net position because there are no owners of the government, and net position is categorized into three parts. Shown below, net investment in capital assets, net of related debt, are equipment or plants or durable goods and less the cost of their depreciation. The restricted net assets are restrained either by law or through external parties, including grantors, creditors, or contributors. Examples reported in GovGuam significant accounting policies are restricted accounts for the Chamorro Lands Loan Guarantee Program, and other bond issues are externally restricted examples. The third account is the unrestricted net position, which are any items not recognized as net investment capital assets or restricted account. The statement of activities presents the operations of a government entity that reports the net expense of individual functions of the primary government and component units. Its purpose is to report any relative financial burden on the taxpayers. Government activities are reported separately from component units like GCC, GPA, and YOG. Those relate to business type activities. Another feature of the statement are program revenues. They are fees collected from those who benefit from the function or program. Charges for service revenue arise from customers who purchase, use, or directly benefit from the goods or service. Program revenues also include operating and capital grants and contributions in the government statement. The general revenues listed are derived from the taxation and investment income and other fees not specifically allocated to programs. GovGuam's income taxes required for workers, the gross receipt taxes applied to the company gross sales, and Section 30 includes immigration and naturalization fees. Moving on to fund financial statements, GovGuam is required to prepare a balance sheet dedicated to governmental funds. The Gov balance sheet uses the current financial resources measurement focus and the modified accrual basis of accounting. This financial statement is a reconciliation summary of the total government fund balance to obtain the net position of the governmental activities in the previous statement. Columns represented are the general fund, and this constitute revenues accrued from taxes, fees, or interest earnings to use for the general operation of the government. The special revenue columns are accounts established to collect money used for a specific project. In GovGuam's example, recently elected major funds due to specific public interests are shown as the COVID-19 Fund and the GDOE Federal Grants Assistance Funds. The COVID-19 Fund is stimulus funding received from the pandemic. GDOE Fed Grants Assistance Funds are activities from U.S. special Fed grants or contract utilized by GovGuam to finance public education. In addition, these funds are under major funds in which they meet the criteria for exceeding expenditures 10% of the total Gov fund expenditures and 5% of the total Gov and enterprise fund expenses. And GovGuam stated in their notes to financial statements that COVID-19 and GDOE grant funds meet the minimum criteria. Now we have the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances. Essentially, it is the financial statements prepared to track the inflow and outflow of funds or resources. With revenues, current expenditures, and other financing sources and uses, the column in this statement mirrors the balance sheet for governmental funds. Key takeaways for the GovGuam's financial statement include most funds with the internal government revenue balance. This revenue is funding received from another government. It's received in the form of grants or reimbursement for costs incurred. In GovGuam's case, the source of these funds are the federal government. Significant expenditures of fiscal year noted in GovGuam MDA included public health on the general fund and 3 special revenue funds. Public welfare is also high expenditures for natural environment and human communities, mainly with the CARES Fund, and public education with the general and the GDOE grant fund. Now I will be passing it on to Somars for the required reconciliations.
So after preparing your financial statements for the governmental fund level and government-wide level, GASB requires for those statements to be reconciled. So more specifically, you reconcile the balance sheet to the statement of net position and reconcile the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances to the statement of activities. Now my question for you guys is, why do we need to reconcile these financial statements? You can pause the video and press play when you have an answer. Okay, we need to reconcile because of differences in measurement focus and accounting basis. So you know your accrual and modified accrual, economic resources, current financial resources. That's why we need to reconcile, because the fund level accounting basis and the measurement focus is different from the government-wide level. So now we will look at GovGuam's financial statements and how they reconcile their financial statements. So on the left, we have the statement of net position, and on the right, we have the balance sheet. We need to reconcile the total fund balance for governmental funds found in your balance sheet to the net position of governmental activities found in your statement of net position. So to do this, there's a number of items that should be reconciled, like depreciation on capital assets or issuance of long-term debt. And you can see here on GovGuam's reconciliation, the They're items that required reconciling. So, for example, capital assets used in governmental activities. These were not reported in the funds, but they were reported in the net position. So, again, because this wasn't reported in the funds, this gets added to the total fund balance. Then another example, long-term liabilities. They weren't reported in the fund, but they were reported in net position. So this gets subtracted from the total fund balance. And then you do all this reconciling for a bunch of items that require reconciling. You add and subtract your amounts from the total fund balance, and your reconciled amount that you arrive at, it should equal to the net position of governmental activities from the statement of net position. And then it's the same procedure, same process for the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance, and the reconciliation to the statement of activities. So you take the total net change in fund balances for your governmental funds that's found in your statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances. You take that amount, you list it at the top of your reconciliation, and then you look at all of the items that require reconciling. Then after you do that, your reconciled amount should be the same as the amount of net change in net position of governmental activities found in your statement of activities. Moving on to intra-entity transactions. So these transactions, they are only recorded if the primary government has component units. And the method to record these transactions, it changes depending on if these component units are blended or discretely presented. So if the transaction was with a blended component unit, then you would generally follow the same standards as reporting, accounting for interfund activities. So if the blended component unit was treated as a governmental fund, then you do not report the transaction at the government-wide level. So GovGuam over here, they have many discretely presented component units, such as UOG, GCC, JWA, all of that. And so all these transactions between the primary government, GovGuam, and its discretely presented component units, because they are treated as external entities, they should be reported as revenues or expenses in the statement of activities. And on a similar note, all receivables and payables that result from these transactions with discretely presented component units, they should be reported in the statement of net position, but on a separate line. So you can see here GovGuam's statement of net position. It's not part of receivables, but it is listed as due from component units, and then it's not listed as accounts payable. It is listed as due to component units. Okay, and now I will be passing it back to Gerald to continue our presentation.
To close off this chapter, I just want to briefly touch on a few other financial reporting issues and topics. First, we have the XBRL, Extensive Business Reporting Language. In this day and age, technology is becoming more and more integrated into our lives. This translates to government accounting. Recently, legislation has been calling for government entities to adopt this format, which allows financial statements to be readable by machines. What it does, apparently, is increase the timeliness and transparency of government financial reporting. Second, we have popular reports. This is quite simple to explain. It's basically a summary data for everyday citizens who don't necessarily have the capacity nor the time to analyze financial reports. It's a highly condensed version of a financial statement. It contains charts, graphs, budget summaries, all described in an easy to read manner. Next, we have special purpose frameworks. The text highlights that many governments report using what is known as a special purpose framework or other comprehensive basis of accounting. There are four primary types: cash, tax, regulatory, and contractual basis of accounting. What you need to know is that it's easier to keep track of accounting internally. this way, but in financial reports, government entities are still required to present statements in accordance to GAAP. Lastly, international accounting standards. I will not be going into detail on this topic due to time constraints, but the only thing you need to know is that there has been a demand, a push for financial statements that can be used by both worldwide by both business and government entities. But this is difficult to achieve, especially because of the differences in focus of governments. They're just so varied, and this is even more exemplified when attempting to universalize government and business accounting, where the gap is much more apparent. And that concludes our presentation on Chapter 9. Thank you.